I was bad counting, so we were 2 seconds ahead of where I thought. Welcome to today's Park Chats. I am really excited to have Dr. Elliot Bowen here today because Dr. Bowen has probably one of my more preferred history references for a full-length academic research book on hot springs. And I'll give you his official bio, and then I will speak a little bit more to what his work in hot springs shows about how this community has done a lot of work to preserve its history and how that assists researchers today about the story of this place. I have to make sure my face works. All right. So Dr. Elliot Bowen is a historian of medicine, as we were talking about earlier, which we are all deeply steeped in. Except one person was actually double steeped with the hand wave, and public health. His research interests center on the history of sexually transmitted diseases and more broadly on the history of gender and sexuality in the modern US. He received his PhD from Binghamton University in 2013 and was an assistant professor of history at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan from 2016 to 2022. And in 2022, he returned to the United States to take up a position as a researcher, writer, and communications director at Knology, a nonprofit organization that produces practical social science to drive positive change. Since joining Knology, he has contributed to numerous peer-reviewed publications focusing on libraries and museums. And though no longer in academia, Elliot maintains an active role as an independent scholar, having recently authored studies on the World Health Organization's campaign against syphilis and the history of efforts to reduce the stigma associated with this and other STDs. And as a historian of medicine, what you have are these windows into American or world society and how people react to different disease outbreaks. Right? There's the medicine of disease, but there's also the cultural layers of disease. Who responds to it and how? What is the medical science? What are the broader implications of how messaging or communities respond or provided treatment or not provided treatment? And so we can actually learn a lot about who we are based on how we respond to these moments of medical crisis. And so as historians of disease, such as Dr. Bowen, there's an opportunity to learn in those intricate and intimate and sometimes uncomfortable moments a little bit deeper a story than we might otherwise be able to learn on a regular day-to-day basis. So, Dr. Bowen, he can't see us, so if we can all give him a hi from the audience. 1, 2, 3. Hi. And now we're going to pretend like he can see all of us, but he hears all of us. And there are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. There's about 15 people in the room with us and untold folks numbers online. So, Dr. Bowen, I leave it to you.
Very cool. Thank you. And I really appreciate that warm introduction. I am thrilled to be here and have the opportunity to give you what I just heard was referred to as a syphilis day. I am an historian of medicine and public health, and syphilis has long been a focal part of my research. I have always found it to be a fascinating disease to study in historical perspective for some of the reasons that were just pointed out. When you study syphilis, you are not just learning about the medical knowledge of the time or existing means of diagnosis and therapy at a particular moment in time. You're also getting insights into lots of other social and cultural phenomena because in any given era, people's responses to this disease are shaped by things like their attitudes toward gender, their attitudes toward sexuality, racial norms and race relations, ideas about class and people's socioeconomic backgrounds. It even extends to things like military conflicts and foreign policy. Syphilis is something that throughout history comes up because it is intertwined with all of these broader phenomena. And so for me, it has been kind of endlessly fascinating to kind of look at syphilis as a mirror for peering into the past more generally to learn about all of these different things. I initially started researching this disease in graduate school. And at the time that I was getting ready to kind of form an idea for my PhD dissertation, I initially thought I was going to do something very different. Like a lot of people who study the history of public health, I wanted to write initially about American imperialism and military conflict, because that is kind of one key topic where you see lots of discussions of syphilis. And I initially was focusing on the Spanish-American War of the late 1800s. And as part of my research, kind of haphazardly, I was doing research about the war in the Philippines, and I stumbled across all of these references to a place called Los Baños, which is in the Philippines, and which is kind of similar to hot springs. In fact, so much so that people were writing about this place said, it reminds us of the therapeutic waters of the hot springs of Arkansas. And at the time, I'd never heard about hot springs, but I kept seeing all of these references in the source material. And eventually I was like, wait, okay, maybe I need to shift gears. What is this place, Hot Springs? What is its association with syphilis? Why are people making these comparisons? And so that was kind of the beginning of the journey for me. And through my research, I discovered that between the late 1800s and the early 20th century, right up until the dawn of the antibiotic era, basically around World War II, hot springs enjoyed a reputation as a private health resort that was a premier destination for people with syphilis in the US. The vast majority of Americans who traveled to hot springs to bathe in the city's near boiling waters during this time period did so because they wanted to be treated for syphilis, a disease that was dramatically thought to be on the rise during this 70-year period or so. So over time, hot springs developed this rather impressive, many-layered therapeutic infrastructure that was organized all around the diagnosis and treatment of syphilis. Not just bathhouses and private doctors' offices, but also, with the passage of time, a military hospital that treated a lot of soldiers and veterans with syphilis, and also the first free and federally operated venereal disease clinic anywhere in the United States came out of Hot Springs. So for more than half a century, this one city was a place that occupied a central position in the United States' ongoing struggle with sexually transmitted illness. And so that was kind of the beginning point for my research. And I have been endlessly curious about the experiences of people who went there. I've been trying to figure out, where did they come from? Why did they go? And what were their experiences like, including their therapeutic outcomes? And as I got into the research more and more, I came across lots of references like the one you're seeing on the screen here, where people talking about others going to hot springs to bathe in the hot water, purportedly because it, as this quote says, soaks the mercury into them. Mercury being the predominant treatment for syphilis up until around the 1920s or so. So I gathered a lot of references from the medical literature, from correspondence, from diaries, other types of materials, and they all seem to be kind of pointing toward the same conclusion, that this was a place that was the therapeutic destination of choice for Americans all across the country who had syphilis. You find all kinds of references to this reputation in the medical literature of the time. And as I said, with the passage of time, that reputation solidified and intensified, so that by the 1920s or so, when the federally funded and run VD clinic was opened, you have people saying, like, to the average person, hot springs means VD, and VD means hot springs. Just to show you the association that was kind of cemented in the public mind at the time. So as I said, my research journey started with some very basic questions. I've always been interested in understanding things from the patient's experience. To the extent that I can in my research, I try to ground myself in the experiences of people who actively have a disease, trying to figure out, what do they do when they get syphilis? Where do they go? What are their experiences like? And what impact do those experiences have more broadly on the way that people in society think about or respond to VD? So these were the kind of initial research questions that guided me as I was going through the process of first writing my dissertation and then ultimately a book. And in doing that, I was very aware of the fact, that there is this broader literature on syphilis. There's a very well-established kind of subfield within the history of medicine that focuses specifically on this disease or sexually transmitted illnesses more broadly. And so from the very beginning, I was kind of conscious of what others have had to say about this book through writings about things like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, the Chicago syphilis experiment from 1937 through 1940, and other kind of general histories of syphilis in the United States, which tend to focus on things like World War I, World War II, and more recently, late 20th century developments. One of the key points that a lot of other scholars make when writing about this disease has to do with morality. There is kind of an argument that gets framed as science versus sin. When people talk about responses to this disease, here's a quote from the famous medical historian Alan Brandt. A lot of people have found that morality has an outsized influence on the way that American society in particular has responded to syphilis. By that meaning that instead of approaching it from a scientific standpoint, from a neutral or objective standpoint, which is to say, this is just one illness like any other illness, we have tended in this country to see syphilis as some type of punishment for sexual immorality. That is kind of a dominant argument within the literature on this topic more broadly. And so going into my own research, I wanted to investigate that. I wanted to know, did that hold up in the case of Hot Springs, or was something else happening? Were therapeutic responses to syphilis secondary to moral responses, as Alan Brandt suggests in his famous book? As I said, I've always been interested in patient narratives. I was very fortunate through my research to find a lot of first-hand direct testimonial evidence coming from people who traveled to Hot Springs, specifically, like this person, Archie Cowell says, to get the benefit of the baths. I have a couple of chapters in the book that are devoted to the experiences of single individuals. For example, Archie Cowell, who traveled to Hot Springs twice in the first decade of the 20th century from his home in Cleveland. He made the journey there on two separate occasions, had rather lengthy stays, and eventually he actually died in Hot Springs due to complications from his illness. But up until that period, he maintained a lengthy correspondence with friends and family back home in Cleveland. And all of those records are preserved, publicly available in archives, both in Ohio and also in Hot Springs, which is where I found them when I was doing research at the Garland County Historical Society. Another example I look at in my book, another patient narrative, if you want to call it that, comes from the correspondence of a man from Florida named Michael J. Murphy, who around the same time, the first decade of the 20th century, traveled to Hot Springs from his home in Florida, also to be treated for syphilis. And during the time that he was there, like Cowles, he also frequently wrote back to loved ones, family members in Florida. This is a set of records that's actually at the National Park Service in Hot Springs, which is where I discovered them. They exist in a published form. And if you read the quote on the screen here, you can see some of the things that people were dealing with at the time. This was quite an intense experience. Syphilis obviously caused these people a lot of pain, a lot of aggravation, but both physically, mentally, and emotionally. Michael J. Murphy, this individual, is actually believed to have committed suicide, taken his own life while in Hot Springs. And the quote that I'm sharing here on the screen is actually what is taken to be his suicide note, his final communication with his family. So as I learned more and more about the experiences of these individuals through reading diaries, correspondence, other types of patient narratives, I became increasingly confident that I really could narrate the experiences of these individuals and get kind of an in-depth understanding of what it was like for them to make this travel to Hot Springs from faraway locations and to get insights into what their experiences were like there. And that is kind of really what the book is built around, these patient narratives of illness. Another source for me in terms of getting kind of a firsthand perspective or understanding of this disease, at the National Archives in Maryland, there are a lot of records maintained by the Public Health Service from the 1920s and 30s, which is when the government was operating the free venereal disease clinic in Hot Springs. And there were a lot of people from across the country who wrote to the director of that clinic personally, or in this case, to the President of the United States himself, at the time, Franklin D. Roosevelt, requesting assistance to get to Hot Springs to obtain treatment. There were a lot of people for whom this was a difficult journey, and there were a lot of people who could not get there because they did not have the resources to travel that period of time or to afford a stay in Hot Springs, given that the treatment for syphilis was a very lengthy one at the time. So it's interesting to me in my research just coming across things like letters like these, where people described, right, in very clear, stark terms, that they had syphilis, that they had been fighting syphilis, that they had been trying to overcome the disease and get rid of it through travel to Hot Springs. What I found interesting about these accounts is that people were very honest, very forthcoming. They were not holding anything back. It did not appear that they felt a great deal of shame or disgrace about their disease. These are people that just wanted to be well and thought that Hot Springs offered a hope of cure for them. Another type of source that I use for my research, not patient narratives, but also giving you a lot of insights into the experiences of specific individuals, clinical case files. There's a chapter of my book that talks specifically about the Army and Navy General Hospital, which operated throughout the late 19th century into the early 20th century. And the military has records for each of the people that were treated there. Sometimes their clinical files are quite lengthy, particularly if they came back repeatedly. And so this was another way to understand from kind of a medical perspective what these individuals were doing. Of course, this is not direct language communicated by patients. It's filtered through their doctors and is recording their personal understandings of what these people were going through. But nevertheless, is a useful source of information for my study, and I got quite a lot out of these clinical case files. So in terms of the findings, what I arrived at after analyzing all of these different sources, two main things that are key to the way that I've kind of understood Hot Springs and its relationship with syphilis. First, one thing that I found is that the people who were going to Hot Springs were not just the passive recipients of care. Despite the fact that they were limited by disease and lots of economic circumstances, they actually had a direct role in shaping the way that this city and by extension, the broader country, thought about and were reacting to syphilis. I really did find a lot of examples of people having agency, of people being able to exert an influence on the way that doctors were dealing with their cases and society more generally. And in tandem with that, I also found that others in Hot Springs, particularly local people, the residents of Hot Springs, also had an impact on the way that syphilis was dealt with. So I just wanted to share a couple of examples from that, focusing specifically on the Hot Springs VD Clinic, which is a topic that I devote a whole chapter to in the book. The clinic was opened in 1921, just a couple years after the conclusion of World War I, which was kind of a high point in the country's interest and concern with sexually transmitted illness. There were lots of fears of a looming venereal disease epidemic coming out of World War I. The government was very much interested in doing things to get control over that epidemic. And one of the ways they did this was in 1921 by establishing the country's first free and federally run VD clinic anywhere in the US. Between 1921 and 1936, the clinic was directed by Oliver C. Wenger. He was a public health service venereologist who spent his entire life devoted to studying this disease and to treating people infected with it. Wenger was very much someone who always had syphilis on the mind. He was obsessed with the disease in all aspects of its manifestations. He is perhaps better known for his later role in both the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and the Chicago syphilis study. But before he did either of those things, for more than 15 years, he was the director of the Hot Springs Clinic. So he oversaw all its operations. He lived in Hot Springs and communicated a lot of his findings with the federal government over that time period. During the time that he was the head of the clinic, about 15, 16 years or so, about 60,000 people came to Hot Springs specifically to be treated at the VD clinic. And you can see from the figure on the screen here, there's a breakdown in terms of race and sex. And you can see over time, from 1922 to 1936, there is a slow rise in all of these groups, specifically for the beginning of the Great Depression in 1929. This really had a catastrophic impact on the spread of syphilis and gonorrhea throughout the country. And with that, the clinic became very, very much inundated with patients from all over the country seeking cures for this disease. When Wenger arrived in Hot Springs, he had what you might call a very traditional understanding of syphilis and where it came from. His mentality was very much that if you want to control the spread of this disease, you need to tackle prostitution. This was a kind of long-running theme in the country's response to syphilis dating back many, many decades. The assumption for almost all of the country's history is that the originating point for syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases is prostitutes. And that's the idea that Wenger had when he came to Hot Springs. In the early 1920s, in the aftermath of World War I, Hot Springs was very much an open town that had a reputation for all things wild, including brothels and gambling, and Wenger wanted none of that. He came into Hot Springs thinking that women were, as you can see from the quotes on the screen here, uncontrolled spreaders of infection, a menace to the community at large. His basic advice to people who he treated at the clinic was keep away from women. So he had ingrained in his head this very kind of stereotypical common understanding that syphilis is a result of the immoral actions of prostitutes. That's where he started out. Interestingly, that is not a view that he maintained. His thinking evolved quite a lot over the course of his time in Hot Springs. He realized some of the flaws in his understanding of gender norms and how syphilis spreads. But as I said, he started out very much with this idea that if you want to get rid of syphilis, you have to get rid of prostitution. And this was, at least in his early days, a focal effort of Wenger's campaign. Particularly with the onset of the Great Depression, however, from 1929 forward, Wenger's interactions with patients who were seeking aid at the clinic forced him to reevaluate this initial idea about prostitutes being the source of venereal contagion in society. He interacted with a lot of patients on a day-to-day basis, and he came to believe ultimately that prostitution is not something people turn to because they are immoral, but instead something that they turn to because they are forced to by the economic conditions of their lives and the fact that they do not receive much support from society elsewhere. In his letters to superiors from the late 1920s onward into the 1930s, he is constantly saying things like you see from the excerpts on the screen here, having interactions with women who, were forced, right, as he said, by dire necessity to support themselves by prostitution. Not a product of immorality, but now he is increasingly seeing syphilis as a product of structural flaws in the country's basic economic makeup. At one point, he wrote to his superiors in Washington saying, "I can't really criticize these people at all because it is hard to be chaste and hungry at the same time." And so at the clinic, as he was having experiences like this, and as he was reevaluating his initial position, he came to realize that an effective response to syphilis cannot just be a medical one. It also needs to have an economic component and a social component. And that was increasingly what he advocated for with the passage of time. And again, just some more examples of how Wenger was increasingly taking an economic approach to venereal disease with the passage of time. He often described the clinic's patients as unfortunate people, right? Not people who are immoral, people who are unfortunate, right? In bad circumstances, who slept out on the hillside or in alleys, begging food from door to door or looking for food in garbage cans. He comes to see, again, that there are these material circumstances that must be addressed if the country is to effectively tackle the problem of syphilis. This also came through in Wenger's evolving understanding of the relationship between race and venereal disease. Again, coming into Hot Springs, Wenger did have a very traditional mentality. The prevailing wisdom within at least the white medical establishment of the time was that higher rates of syphilis among Black Americans could be traced to things like their cultural norms, their sexual values. This is something that Wenger had lots of opportunities to critique and reevaluate during his years in Hot Springs. And he initially came to the conclusion, as you can see from the quote here on the screen, that really the only differences between white Americans and Black Americans can be boiled down to social and economic backgrounds. There are other ways also in which Wenger's campaign against syphilis within Hot Springs evolved over the years. And I just wanted to touch on one of them really quickly because it speaks to how Hot Springs fits into kind of a broader national narrative of the country's struggles with syphilis at this time. Initially, when he came to Hot Springs, Wenger, like his allies in the public health service, were very much hoping that Hot Springs could be a kind of experimental location, a site for figuring out what worked and what didn't in the treatment of syphilis, and then for exporting some of those lessons learned or those best practices to other parts of the country. So in other words, Wenger thought that by conducting therapeutic experiments with this enormous base of syphilis patients in Hot Springs, he would be able to kind of standardize the treatment of VD and create a model that other doctors and other clinics throughout the country could follow. And so throughout his time in Hot Springs, there were numerous experiments or studies conducted on the effectiveness of different treatment methods. There were a lot of things that were tried, different medicines, combinations of therapeutic responses like mercury and later salvarsan with therapeutic treatment. Initially, the idea, as I said before, was that this research would lead to a kind of model that could be sold and used elsewhere, but it actually did not turn out that way because of the difficulties that a lot of his patients experience in Hot Springs, difficulties related to having enough money to stay in the city long enough to complete a course of treatment, difficulties getting to and leaving Hot Springs. It was very difficult to conduct a study, to enroll patients in a study that would, progress over a period of time because, well, as he says in this quote here, because of the transient character of the patients, right? People always moving in and out, again, because they did not have the material resources to be able to complete a course of therapy. So all of this kind of feeds into the approach that Wenger starts to take in the early to mid 1930s, when Wenger starts to realize that really what needs to be done to make Hot Springs and its methods effective is to kind of take care of some of those basic concerns that people have and that need to be addressed in order to keep them there in Hot Springs long enough to complete a course of treatment. In 1934, you can see if you look on the screen here, there's an interesting change or shift where the average number of treatments that patients were receiving started to go up noticeably. And the reason for that was that Wenger was successful in getting the city to provide free room and board to patients who came for treatment. So instead of having to pay for their own stays, there was money available to them to stay longer in Hot Springs, and that had a noticeable impact, right? As you can see from this upward trend in the number of injections people are getting. Unfortunately, this provoked some resistance within the town. There were a lot of people in Hot Springs at the time who disliked the city's association with syphilis for understandable reasons. Did not want Hot Springs to be known as a place where, as this one judge said in a letter from 1934, the scum of the earth come to stay. So the success of Wenger's campaign over time invited a lot of criticism and hostile responses locally, as people resented the fact that the federal government had set up this clinic and now was taking steps to ensure that patients could stay for longer periods of time within the city. So there was local resistance to Wenger's plan that increased over the course of the mid-1930s. That resistance is part of what led to kind of the end point in Wenger's campaign. In 1935, Wenger convinced the Public Health Service to open a special camp on the outskirts of town. The camp was called Camp Garraday. It ran for a few years, and what it did, I don't know if you can see the images on the screen here, but it was a way to provide for the basic material necessities of some of the clinic's patients who had a place to stay and sleep, a place for recreation, a place where they were fed, all provided for by the federal government. Now, interestingly, Camp Garraday, only people who were eligible for staying there were white men. It was restricted to one particular patient group. Wenger and his associates were less concerned with the circumstances that others were facing. For example, there were no white women who were allowed to stay in the camp, nor were there Black men or Black women who ever were admitted to Camp Garraday or had the opportunity to take advantage of some of the extra medical forms of care that it offered. And this is one of the places where you can directly see some of the impact of racial mentalities and gender norms operating on the way the country responds to venereal disease. In Wenger's mind, as was the case for a lot of people around the country at this time, it is white men who are selected for this special privilege of this camp, while others are left to fend for themselves. The camp remained open from 1935 to 1937, and toward the end of the 1930s, finally, Hot Springs' reputation with syphilis starts to ebb, particularly with the onset of World War I in 1941 and the development of penicillin, the first effective antibiotic treatment, which was used for syphilis and gonorrhea. Finally, it's at that point in time where you see this association between Hot Springs and syphilis start to recede a little bit. And part of that is also because of the local resistance that we saw erupting in the mid-1930s in particular. So I think that's where I will leave it. I want to make sure that there is time for questions or comments. If anything comes up that you'd like to talk a lot about more, I'm very curious to know what everyone has to think. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Dr. Bowen, this is not on. It is on. I have to flip the thing on. It is on.
Yeah.
All right. Dr. Bowen, thank you so much for going over your research and also focusing on a lot of those stories from people who came to Hot Springs. I know that I have several questions, and we will also have questions from the audience. Would y'all like me to prep the first question, or do you think we can just jump into it?
I'm happy to just jump in. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, they're very proud of themselves and they're ready to go. What you got?
Is that why Al Capone came here? Because of he had syphilis?
Is that why Al Capone came here? Is because he had the disease?
It's definitely one of the reasons. Al Capone, we now know, was dealing with the late stage of syphilis, which is called neurosyphilis, where the disease spreads to the nervous system and to the brain as well. This is a very difficult thing for doctors to treat in the 1930s and 1940s. In fact, interestingly, this is kind of an aside, but it's something that's received a lot of attention from historians. A prominent treatment for neurosyphilis at the time was something called malaria therapy, where syphilis patients would actually be exposed to the bite of a mosquito infected with malaria. And the idea was that the fever that malaria produces in the body would essentially cook out syphilis germs from the body. This was a treatment pioneered in 1927 by a German physician who eventually won a Nobel Prize for it. It is a very contested and problematic type of therapy, as you might surmise, but it is what Al Capone and others dealing with neurosyphilis would have been confronting in the 1930s and 40s. But yes, that is definitely one of the reasons. We don't know too much about Al Capone's experience of being in Hot Springs, at least from on the medical side. It's something that is kind of fascinating to speculate about. We also know, obviously, that he was interested in Hot Springs because it was a place that was amenable to all of the other shady things he was doing business-wise. But yes, that definitely is part of the reason, the same reason that would have driven many other people with syphilis to Hot Springs during that time.
That's a nice doctor.
Oh, yeah.
Does he have proof that Al Capone, does he have documentation that Al Capone was treated here in Hot Springs? We know he came to the clubs and to the racetrack and such and the nightlife, but does he have the documentation for that, for Al Capone being treated in Hot Springs for syphilis?
Dr. Bowen, unfortunately for you, you are the best medical historian of Hot Springs, so you are going to get the questions that we've always been wanting to know. If there's actual documentation of Al Capone receiving treatment, or if the myth is stronger than reality.
He does not come up in the clinical records. So there is no direct evidence of Al Capone receiving treatment. You could not say that he was in the city on such and such date and went to either Wenger's clinic or another private doctor's establishment. We can't say with that level of certainty that he was in Hot Springs for treatment. We know for sure that he had neurosyphilis. That's something that even was documented at the time. But that's kind of as far as we can go. So we could surmise that one of the reasons he would have been here was to be treated for syphilis. But beyond that, it is kind of dwelling in the realm of what I might call historical fiction.
You've probably read through more doctor's notes than the rest of us, so congratulations on having that readily available off the top of your head. And you had mentioned the third stage. Could you just briefly go back over stages 1, 2, and 3 of a syphilis course of disease?
Yeah, sure. This is an important thing to take note of because with the advent of antibiotics in the 1940s, we do not often see the later stages of syphilis anymore. Usually it's broken down into 3 big stages. The first, the primary phase, is where you have the initial lesion or sore appearing on the point of your body where you were exposed to the virus or the germs. So for most people, it appears on the genitalia and stays there for about 6 to 8 weeks or so, depending on what you do with treatment. Obviously, with antibiotics today, it is a lot harder or a lot easier to control those kind of initial manifestations and the symptoms that come along with it. But if left untreated or if treated poorly, it often progresses to a secondary stage where symptoms manifest more generally across the body. So not just the initial point of infection, but it becomes kind of a more superficial dermatological condition from head to toe, most often appearing as rashes and skin lesions all over the body. So this is the time when syphilis kind of is diffused throughout the body and can appear in lots of different areas. For a lot of people, well, I don't know if a lot is the right word. For some people, after the second stage, the disease appears to recede or to not, provoke any strong symptoms. But usually what happens with the passage of time, again, if untreated or poorly treated, is that it comes back as a tertiary stage. And in that final stage of the disease, that's where you see things like neurosyphilis, where the bacteria have spread to some of the major vital organs, the heart, the lungs, the liver, the brain included. And that is where you see syphilis resulting in something that is, it used to be called GPI, general paresis of the insane. So any, discussions of how syphilis is a cause of madness or mental instability in any way, that's usually a sign that it has reached that third stage of neurosyphilis, where it is much harder to treat and can often lead to death.
Hopefully the medical journey was all right for the audience to also go through.
And the other interesting thing, I guess I would say there, with respect to how the disease often gets written about in the historical scholarship, and kind of what sets my study apart a little bit, is that we often only think about syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases in their acute stage. The first stage of the disease is where you are most infectious and kind of most a public health threat to others. So it's highly communicable in the period after you've initially contracted it, less so later on. But as I found through the course of my research, obviously, like, syphilis is not just this acute infection that you get and then you spread and then it goes away. Especially in the time before antibiotics, it lingers for a long time in the body, affecting people both physically, mentally, and emotionally. And so, the framing that I kind of take in my research is looking at syphilis as a chronic condition, as something that people experience for months and years, and as something that can, in some ways, define their whole lives. And I think from that standpoint, from seeing it as a chronic illness that can cause long-term disability in people, is something that's very clear from studying the medical records of hot springs, where you have people like Archie Cowles who are returning year after year to bathe in the city's waters. It's undeniable that this was not just something that causes this flashpoint in society, but something that people struggled with for a very long period of time, and had big ripple impacts on their lives, on their families' lives, on their communities, etc. So that's one of the things I was hoping to call attention to in the book.
Yes, I'm really just here to thank Dr. Bowen. I just finished my master's degree, and I used his book extensively for one of my term papers on the parallel worlds of prostitution and BD treatment in hot springs during that period. And he also turns up in the first chapter of my thesis. So thank you, Dr. Bowen. I really appreciate working with you.
You're welcome, and I'm very excited to hear that. It sounds like really interesting research.
And the camera's not on her, but she is right here as a highlight. And so after the Q&A, she can see you in person.
Yeah, I would love to chat.
That would be great.
There's a lot more work that can be done, and there are things that I could not investigate due to limitations in time and money, and that I've tried to kind of poke around a little bit more since my book came out. I think one of the really interesting things to study also, especially with Wenger being in Hot Springs, but also a part of the federal government, and like the city's relationship to the federal government, as a piece of land that Congress had set aside, right, for the public's enjoyment dating back to the 1830s, is just like how that relationship between local and state and federal played out over time within the context of public health work. There's a lot of interesting stories to be told, I think, just about how those different layers of public health worked out, and how people sometimes work together, sometimes were in conflict about like the role that each of those kind of different governmental entities should play in determining what happened in hot springs. So some of the more recent research that I've been doing looks kind of at the state level at Arkansas, and how the commissioners of health were playing a role in this process too. It's not something I explored in the book, but like there's definitely a lot more to open up about this city and state's relationship with syphilis historically.
And we don't like to brag, but we could be kind of a big deal. But so we appreciate your initial research.
I mean, I talk about hot springs as a local node with national significance, and I think there is a bigger story to be told that also extends past the time frame of my book. Because, even though Wenger left the clinic in the late 1930s and fewer patients were coming to hot springs to be treated for syphilis from around the country with the dawn of the antibiotic era, in particular in the 1940s, that doesn't mean everything came to a crashing halt. There was still a lot of interest in the medical community in figuring out how hot springs could be part of kind of a new post-war response to syphilis. And as rates of the disease started to climb again in the 1950s and 60s, you do have kind of people looking back to hot springs as some type of historical precedent. So I think there's also kind of a post-1945 story to be told. It's just not one that I had time for or the resources to tell in the book. But yeah, there's lots of other interesting stories, lots of other very well-known people who were in hot springs. For example, in the aftermath of World War II, some of you may know the famous sex researcher Alfred Kinsey. He was in hot springs for a while. He interacted with a lot of people in the federal government, people in the kind of venereological community that had been built up within hot springs, where you had these people who were specialists in the treatment of a disease that was kind of intertwining with Kinsey's own research, right? So there's lots of examples like that where you can kind of continue the story after World War II.
Success rate on curing syphilis with hot water or mercury.
All right, I told you we'd get this question. What was the success rate down to the 100th percentile? 100th percentile of curing syphilis with hot water and or mercury?
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that question. I think, we have to be a little bit careful with what we mean when we ask questions like, what did it work? Were people cured? Was it successful? Because the past is a different country, and people who live there think and acted very differently than we would today. Most notably, for a considerable portion of the time that my book focuses on, people didn't know what caused syphilis. Right? That discovery only happened in 1905, when the bacteria that causes the disease was discovered. But before that, when people thought about syphilis, they weren't thinking about it in terms of a bacteria. So when they thought about cure, they thought about not, did this germ disappear from my body, but were the symptoms that they were experiencing alleviated by their experience in hot springs. And from a symptomological point of view, we know pretty clearly from the medical literature that people were deriving a lot of benefits from both the waters and the combination therapy that was very popular at the time, which is a combination of mercury, which was often rubbed directly onto the body as kind of an ointment, and then bathing in the waters to kind of flush out some of the toxins that mercury, a toxic substance, could spread and introduce into the body. So in terms of pain relief, in terms of what you might call basic medical treatment, I think people did experience quite a lot of relief. Did it cure them? Based on their understanding at the time, right? It's a little bit of a difficult question to answer. The other thing that is interesting, and that I talk a lot about in my research, is that there are many dimensions to syphilis, and not all of them are biological. There's also a huge cultural and psychological component to the experience of syphilis. And one of the things I discovered through reading all of these patient narratives in particular is that when people came to Hot Springs, just by virtue of the fact that they were living among other people with their disease, they often felt a sense of relief. Whatever feelings of shame or guilt they were harboring were often alleviated by being in the company of other people who were just like themselves. Instead of viewing themselves as immoral or as sinners, I think a lot of the people like Archie Cowles, for example, came to realize that they were just unfortunate, that this is something that could happen to anyone, and did, right? And within Hot Springs, because you had this mass of syphilitic sufferers living together and communing and seeing each other, Hot Springs was kind of a destigmatized environment. It was a place where those ideas about shame and guilt kind of exited people's bodies and their minds. And that is something that I think on some occasions contributed to positive therapeutic outcomes. Because we know that when, people do not have psychological stress associated with an illness, they are more motivated to seek out treatment and to continue a course of treatment for as long as they can, because they do not see themselves as deserving recipients of an immoral disease. They just see themselves as unlucky, and as people who have the opportunity to get better. So seeing the experiences of other people experience relief from their symptoms, talking and communing with those other people, I think that is perhaps the biggest effect that Hot Springs had on people and their therapeutic outcomes, just alleviating the stigmas associated with syphilis.
We have time for probably one more question, maybe to the audience. If not, I do have one more final question myself. Oh, what you got?
Are those buildings still standing, the VD clinic and the camp? Are they?
Is the BD clinic and Camp Garraday facilities still standing?
Yeah, I don't know about Camp Garraday. I am uncertain as to how long the physical construction, how long the physical structure continued to exist. I don't know what has happened to it now. That is a great question.
By the school district, or some of those buildings were for Camp Garraday, getting nods from the Camp Garraday researchers.
Awesome, thank you. A lot of the other facilities were repurposed within short order. So the VD clinic kind of became what was termed a national medical center, continued to operate even after Wenger left through the 1940s into the early 1950s. And it was home to a lot of researchers who were doing therapeutic experiments, particularly combining hydrotherapy with new and emerging techniques for treating syphilis, including the use of penicillin and other antibiotics. A lot of the other bathhouses and medical establishments were similarly repurposed with a focus on other types of diseases that are kind of in the same neighborhood symptomatically as syphilis. So for example, in the 1940s, the 1950s, as people are still coming to Hot Springs to be treated for disease, because in particular after World War II, there's a lot of patients in need of the therapeutic services that hot springs could provide. But they're not necessarily coming to be treated for syphilis, but for some of the other things that hot springs had often been associated with for a long period of time, like rheumatoid arthritis. Arthritis and kind of rehabilitative therapy becomes kind of a huge concern for physicians and for federal officials in Hot Springs from the 1940s onward. And so, like a lot of the bathhouses, a lot of the private doctors' offices kind of make that pivot from syphilis to arthritis and rehabilitative therapy going forward. And that allowed some of these structures to continue to exist, but with a new focus.
Not always the transition that people would imagine from. I do have one last question. You found an incredible amount of first-person accounts of coming to Hot Springs, and like a patient narrative seems really remarkable to find just one of and to have multiple of. And you also mentioned that you were thinking through race and gender when you were looking in public class, when you were looking at those patient narratives. Do you have did we see any examples, or do you have one that comes to mind of a woman who is coming to Hot Springs, navigating all the social and cultural, and then also trying to experience the medical treatments here?
That is a great question. The two main patient narratives that I used for the study, Archie Cowles and Michael J. Murphy, were, from what I can tell, and part of this was, looking at census records as well, both white men. There are accounts of women coming to Hot Springs and keeping diaries that are in archives throughout the country, a lot of state archives. I was not able to find any that spoke either to syphilis or to therapeutic experiences more generally. Unfortunately, in those accounts, a lot of which are just diaries, you have kind of people recounting their experiences of being in the city, but not mentioning things like going to the bathhouse or going to a doctor's office to be diagnosed or treated. It just doesn't lend itself to the same type of like medical history analysis that the other two patient narratives do. So due to the fact that those sources aren't patient narratives, it's a little bit hard to bring them into the type of research I was doing. But of course, they could be used for other purposes. I think, yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Well, I think we will leave it there as well. Thank you so much again. A round of applause from the unseen crowd. And how can people reach you if they have questions?
Yeah, you can. Probably the easiest way to reach me is just by email. My email address is elliotgbowen@gmail. It's 2 L's and 2 T's, just my name. And yeah, I'd be happy to chat, correspond, answer more follow-up questions, anybody who has them. Really, really, really glad to have you here and to be able to contribute to this lecture series.
Does anybody need to hear that a second time?
Yes.
Yeah, elliotgbowen@gmail.com. So it's ELLIOTT Bowen, my last name BOWEN @gmail.com.
Thank you once again. And next month, we'll be right back here on the fourth Wednesday of June with another doctor, this Dr. Dan. So we're going to go Elliot's and Dan's. We're doing the first part of the alphabet. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ranger.
The audience saying hi.
Okay, Paul, before you